The first lie was the hardest. It was the moment I stepped over the threshold of my own home, the scent of lavender and old books replaced by a sterile, cloying sweetness I didn't recognize. The floorboards, which had grown a familiar welcome to me for 40 years, seemed to protest my return, their sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet. My son, Liam, and his wife, Isabel, hadn't expected me. My business trip to Boston was meant to last through the weekend, but a sudden nor'easter had grounded every flight out of Logan. The cab ride to the coast of Port Blossom, Massachusetts, had been a blur of wind-whipped trees and slate-gray skies. I had imagined their surprise, perhaps a shared laugh over my unexpected return. But as I paused on the bluestone walkway, fumbling for my keys, a sound drifted from the slightly ajar kitchen window. It wasn't laughter. It was the low, conspiratorial murmur of my son's voice, a tone that coiled like a snake in the pit of my stomach. "It has to look natural, Isabel," he said, the words clipped, anxious. "A gradual decline. Are you sure the dosage is right?" Isabel's reply was not a whisper, but a statement of fact, as placid and unruffled as the surface of a frozen pond. "Of course. It's a custom compound, entirely untraceable. In a month, she won't even remember her own name." My breath hitched, trapped in my lungs, my suitcase handle dug into my palm, the cold plastic a grounding anchor in a world that had just tilted on its axis. Dosage, decline, my own son, my own home. The words were shards of glass, shredding the tapestry of every memory I held dear. I stood there, rooted to the spot by a cold more biting than the autumn wind, a silhouette of a mother eavesdropping on the planning of her own erasure. For a long, silent moment, I considered turning around, walking back down the path, and disappearing into the storm. But then, a different kind of cold settled over me. It was not fear. It was resolve. I straightened my spine, smoothed the front of my coat, and composed my face into a mask of weary surprise. Then, I opened the door. The performance had begun. The moment I stepped inside, Isabel spun around from the kitchen island, a startled but perfectly formed smile instantly appearing on her face. Liam, who had been leaning against the refrigerator, stiffened, his hand frozen on the handle. The air was thick with their unasked questions. "The storm," I announced, my voice a little too bright, a little too frail. "They canceled everything. Surprise." I let my keys clatter into the ceramic bowl by the door, the sound unnervously loud in the tense silence. Isabel rushed forward, her arms open for a hug. I leaned into her embrace, the clean, powdery scent of her perfume making me feel nauseous. It was a dizzying, surreal sensation, to be held by someone who had just calmly discussed the dismantling of your mind. She pulled back, her hands still on my shoulders, her eyes, a pale, dispassionate blue, scanning my face with an unnerving intensity. "Oh, Ilara, you look exhausted. Let me get you something warm. A nice herbal tea?" "That would be lovely, dear," I murmured, my gaze drifting past her to Liam. He offered a tight, forced smile, mumbling something about the wicked weather. His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. I saw it then. The deep, festering insecurity I had always known was there, now twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. Dinner was a masterclass in deception. Isabel moved around the kitchen with an effortless grace, preparing a chicken pot pie whose comforting aroma felt like a betrayal. She asked polite, empty questions about my trip, and I answered with deliberate vagueness. I let my sentences drift off, paused mid-thought as if grasping for a word that had slipped away. I watched their eyes flicker towards each other over the rim of my teacup. Quick, subtle glances of confirmation. They were seeing what they wanted to see. Later, while unpacking, I purposefully left a small bottle of my heart medication on the bathroom counter. A few minutes later, I walked into the living room and asked Isabel if she'd seen it, feigning a flutter of panic. She retrieved it for me with a gentle, patronizing smile. "Right where you left it, Elara. Don't you worry." I took it from her, my hand trembling just slightly. It was a good performance. Convincing. That night, I lay in my bed, the familiar weight of my grandmother's quilt, doing nothing to warm the ice that had settled in my bones. This was not the house I had left just 3 days ago, and they were not the family I thought I knew. I stared into the darkness, not with fear, but with a chilling, crystalline focus. Every performance has a beginning, and I had just taken my place on the stage. By morning, the house had adopted a new, unsettling rhythm. It was a rhythm of surveillance disguised as care. Liam left early for a meeting at the bank he'd vaguely mentioned, but Isabel remained, a constant, hovering presence. Her warmth was a suffocating blanket, her casual concern a form of supervision. I moved through my morning rituals with calculated slowness, letting my hand falter as I reached for the coffee filters, slurring my words just enough to be noticeable. When she offered to pour my coffee, I smiled and declined, making a small show of my independence. The moment she stepped into the garden to take a phone call, her voice a low, professional murmur, I moved with a speed that would have shocked her. I went to the back of the study, to the old roll-top desk that had belonged to my husband, Arthur. It was a place of memories, a place they ignored. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of his old architectural blueprints, was a small, sleek audio recorder I'd bought for birdwatching years ago. It was dusty, but the battery was still good. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan and was back at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the sugar bowl, when she returned. "Did I take my blood pressure pills this morning?" I asked, my voice clouded with manufactured confusion. Isabel's smile was patient, saccharine. "Yes, you did, Elara. About an hour ago. I watched you." I nodded slowly, my eyes drifting toward the window as if I'd already forgotten the conversation. The seed was planted. Let it grow. That afternoon, I devised another test. I left my tablet face up on the hall table, intentionally setting a calendar alert for a neurology consult with Dr. Albright to go off in 15 minutes. I knew Isabel's quiet curiosity was a form of intelligence gathering. As I busied myself on the porch, ostensibly deadheading the last of the autumn roses, I watched her reflection in the glass of the front door. She picked up the tablet, her thumb swiping across the screen. A moment later, she placed it back down in the exact same position. When I came back inside, the notification had been cleared. I had to hide a grim smile. She was taking the bait. At dinner, the theater continued. I told a rambling story about our old golden retriever, Samson, claiming he'd been barking at the mailman all morning. Samson had passed away over a decade ago. Liam exchanged a heavy, meaningful look with Isabel. He gently corrected me, and I feigned a moment of heartbreaking confusion. "Oh," I said, my voice small. "Of course. How silly of me." Later, when asking for the pepper, I called Isabel by my sister's name, Julia. I corrected myself, but a beat too late. She said nothing, but her eyes narrowed with a flicker of triumphant certainty. That night, after they had gone to bed, I retrieved the recorder from my pocket. I sat in the dark of my reading chair, the chair Arthur had always sat in, and played it back. Their voices were whispers, sharp and clear in the silence of the house. Liam's voice was strained. "She's slipping faster than we thought. Did you hear her today? The dog, Julia. It's the compound." Isabel's voice was clinical, detached. "It's designed to amplify existing mild cognitive issues. It makes everything more plausible. The doctor will have no choice but to back our assessment when we present the paperwork." I let the words wash over me, settling in my chest like silt. Heavy, cold, predictable. I took the recorder and labeled a small USB drive. I transferred the file, naming it Day 1. Then I hid the drive inside the hollowed-out spine of an old copy of Moby Dick on the highest shelf in the study. They were building their case against me. I was building mine against them. The performance was no longer just an act. It had become my armor. By the end of the first week, my new life had a strange, disorienting routine. I would wake early, shuffle through the house with a convincing air of forgetfulness, and retreat to the garden, where I held long, one-sided conversations with Arthur's prized rose bushes. From the corner of my eye, I could see Isabel watching from the kitchen window, her expression a careful mixture of pity and resolve. They were growing more confident, more relaxed in their deception, believing I was fading into a gentle, manageable twilight. I let them believe it. One morning, I overheard Isabel on the phone again, this time in the sunroom. Her voice was hushed, but the glass panes did little to muffle her words. I caught phrases that made my blood run cold: waiting for the physician's signature, a question of capacity, and pre-approval from the trust administrator. I stood just out of sight in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to take a slow, steadying breath, then turned and walked away, humming a tuneless melody as I went to the kitchen to boil water for a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. That afternoon, with Liam out and Isabel napping upstairs, I sat at the small writing desk in the guest room, a room I hadn't used in years. I pulled out a box of colored sticky notes and a pen. On each small square, I began to build my archive. Some notes were mundane: real appointments, grocery lists, to create a plausible cover. But most were fragments of my new reality: Isabel's call, capacity, physician's signature, Liam, meeting with bank, trust administrator, compound, amplifies cognitive issues. I wrote down names, dates, phrases I had overheard. Each note was a brick in the wall I was building around myself. I found an old shoebox in the back of the closet, lined it with acid-free envelopes, and began to seal each sticky note inside its own sleeve, labeled meticulously by date. At the bottom of the box, I placed a backup USB drive containing all the audio recordings from my pocket recorder, which now ran silently every evening from its hiding place beneath the cushion of my armchair. My archive of betrayal. That evening at dinner, I let the silence stretch until it was taut and uncomfortable. It was Isabel who finally broke it. "Are you feeling all right, Elara? You seem very quiet tonight." I offered her a soft, vacant smile. "Sometimes I feel like the days are all blending together now," I said, my voice wistful. Her eyes shone with a cold, satisfied light. "We should talk soon," she added gently, her tone dripping with false concern. "About simplifying some of your affairs, just to make sure things don't become too complicated for you later on." I nodded, my gaze distant, as if I couldn't quite grasp the gravity of her words, but I understood perfectly. They were moving from suggestion to action. I waited until well after midnight, until the old house was steeped in the profound silence of the sleeping coast. I crept downstairs into the dining room. I knew Liam always left his laptop charging on the sideboard. I didn't touch it, but I stood over it for a long moment. The screen was asleep, but not locked. I nudged the mousepad with a gloved finger. The screen glowed to life, revealing an open browser tab for a major insurance company and a document minimized at the bottom of the screen labeled Guardianship Draft, Vance. The next morning, as Isabel prepared one of her nutrient-rich smoothies, her new preferred method for delivering the compound, I placed the small audio recorder at the base of the flower vase on the breakfast table. It was a risk, but I needed more than just their whispered plans. I needed the texture of their deception, the condescending sweetness in her tone, the way she gently guided every conversation toward my dependency. She handed me the glass, a lovely lavender-colored concoction. I looked her straight in the eye, smiled my thanks, and took a long, deliberate sip. Her own smile was one of complete chilling control. As soon as she turned her back, I spat the mouthful into a napkin and later flushed the rest of the drink down the toilet. That evening, I sat in my reading chair, the shoebox of evidence tucked beside me, hidden beneath a throw blanket. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. My hands trembled, not from age or the effects of their poison, but from the furious, contained energy of it all. The betrayal, the strategy, the quiet, terrifying long game. I feigned fatigue, leaning my head back against the cushions and closing my eyes, but my mind was a razor, sharp and focused and far from done. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I found Liam sitting alone on the back porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out across the dormant yard. He didn't look up as I slid the glass door open, just gave a slight nod, as if he'd been expecting me. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and took the wicker chair across from him. The air was crisp and smelled of salt and decaying leaves. For a long time, we just sat in the shared silence, a silence that felt heavy with years of unspoken words. "Your father used to sit right here every single morning," I said finally, my voice gentle. "He said watching the Finches was better than reading the news." Liam's jaw tightened. He took a sip of his coffee. "He always thought you'd be the one to take over the garden," I continued, watching his face for any flicker of emotion. "Said you had the hands for it. Quiet strength, he called it." A sharp, humorless breath escaped him. "He always had something to say about what I wasn't," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the distant gray line of the ocean. "Never what I was." I let his words hang in the cold air. Then I asked softly, "What do you think he missed?" For the first time that morning, Liam turned to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot and weary, a fatigue that went deeper than a lack of sleep. "He didn't get me," he said, his voice raw. "He thought you were the smart one, the organized one. I was just the one who forgot my homework, who lost my keys. When I dropped out of business school, he didn't even yell. He just got this look, disappointed. That was always worse than yelling." I felt the familiar ache of that old wound. I had watched Arthur create it, unable to stop his relentless, quiet pressure. "He worried about you more than anyone," I said, the truth of it sharp in my own heart. "He just didn't know how to say it without pushing. He thought if he pushed you hard enough, you'd finally become the man he couldn't be." Liam looked away, his shoulders slumping. "And when he died," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was still painfully fresh, "you handled everything. The estate, the funeral, the lawyers. No one asked me to do a single thing. I felt like a guest at my own father's service." The confession was a crack in the armor he had built around himself. "You were never a guest, Liam," I said, my voice firm but kind. "You were just grieving in a way none of us understood. And maybe you still are." He didn't answer, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture, as if a tightly wound spring had finally begun to unwind. I reached across the small table and rested my hand on his. It felt small and frail against his own. "It's not too late to be something different," I whispered. "You are not bound by the shadow he cast." He gave a slow, hesitant nod, his eyes still on the horizon. For a fleeting moment, he looked like the lost little boy I remembered. But as I offered him this small measure of comfort, a cold reality settled over me. His pain might have been the soil in which this betrayal grew, but Isabel had been the one to plant the seed. His hurt explained his choices, but it did not excuse them. I squeezed his hand, pressed a kiss to his temple, and went back inside. In the privacy of my room, I took out a fresh sticky note. I wrote down every word he had said, every sentence that laid bare his fear, his shame, and his motive. Understanding the man did not mean I could trust him. Compassion was not the same as permission. The next morning, I made the call I had been dreading. I hadn't spoken to Genevieve Croft in almost 5 years, but her number was still listed in my old, leather-bound address book. She had been my roommate in college, a force of nature even then, and had spent the last 30 years as a fierce advocate for elder rights. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and no-nonsense as I remembered. We met at a small, out-of-the-way diner miles from Port Blossom. Genevieve arrived in a tailored pantsuit, her silver hair coiled in an elegant bun. She looked ageless, composed, impossible to fool. She skipped the pleasantries. "Tell me everything, Ilara." I slid a manila folder across the vinyl tabletop. It contained photocopies of emails between Liam and a financial advisor I had never authorized, discussing strategic asset control and guardianship options. I handed her the USB drive next. We sat in silence as she plugged it into a small laptop and listened to the recordings through a single earbud, her expression growing more severe with each passing moment. Finally, I produced a small, sterile vial I'd purchased from the pharmacy. Inside was the residue from one of Isabel's smoothies, which I'd managed to salvage before washing the glass. Genevieve's gaze was grave when she finally looked up. "Ilara, you cannot stay in that house. If they're this far along, they won't hesitate to force the issue. Any small, genuine slip-up could be used to validate their claims." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of vindication and profound dread. "I'm not ready to leave," I told her. "Not yet. There's more I need to do." I explained my hidden archive, the backup copies, and the fact that I had already moved my original medical proxy documents to a safe deposit box months ago, a precaution Arthur and I had taken after his diagnosis. Genevieve placed her hand over mine, her touch firm and reassuring. "You're doing everything right," she said, "but you need to decide on your final move before they make theirs." That night, back in the suffocating quiet of the house, I reread a note I'd written to myself months before Arthur passed away. It was a simple list: bank contacts, attorney's name, asset file locations, and one final sentence. "If anything happens to me suddenly, know that none of this was an accident." I sealed it in an envelope and taped it to the underside of my nightstand drawer, a message from the grave just in case. The morning sun cast long, distorted stripes across the study floor. Isabel was at a yoga class, and Liam was in the shower. It was the window I needed. I unlocked the bottom drawer of Arthur's old filing cabinet, a drawer they'd never thought to check. Inside lay the original trust documents we had signed years ago. Next to them was a revised version, notarized quietly just 6 months before Arthur's death. This version bypassed Liam entirely, naming our longtime family advisor, Alistair Finch, as the sole financial executor. Alongside it was the true power of attorney, already filed with our bank, granting full authority to Alistair. My fingers traced the elegant, familiar sweep of Arthur's signature. His trust in me was embedded in the very ink on the page. We had seen the subtle shifts in Liam, the growing influence of Isabel, and had quietly, preemptively, built a fortress around our legacy. I placed the crucial documents into a sealed folder and tucked it into my tote bag. That afternoon, in Alistair's quiet, wood-paneled office, he confirmed everything was secure. We had placed a freeze on all major withdrawals months ago. Liam's name was nowhere near any decision-making authority. Before I left, I gave Alistair another USB drive. Not all the evidence, but enough to establish a pattern. He agreed to store it off-site with an affidavit from Genevieve outlining the timeline of events. When I returned home, Brendan and Isabel were in the kitchen, humming as they prepared dinner. The air smelled of garlic and rosemary, comfort food, a tool of manipulation. Later, as we sat at the dinner table, Liam casually brought up the idea of consolidating some household accounts to make things simpler. I smiled gently, excused myself from the table, and began to wash the dishes, my back turned to them. The cracks in their plan were beginning to form. They just didn't know that the ground beneath their feet had already been removed. I was no longer reacting to their plot. I was quietly, methodically, leading them to its inevitable end. By Thursday, I knew it was time to escalate the performance. They needed to feel a sense of urgency, the kind that would justify their next, bolder move. That morning, I walked into the living room wearing my cardigan inside out, my hair a tangled mess. I was holding a wooden spoon. Kayla looked up from her laptop, a flicker of concern, or was it excitement, in her eyes. "Need help with something, Alara?" she asked in her sickly sweet voice. I stared at the spoon in my hand as if I'd never seen it before. "I was looking for my glasses," I mumbled, then wandered away. The charade continued all day. I watered the silk ferns in the dining room. I left the refrigerator door open for nearly half an hour. That evening, I let a pot of soup burn on the stove, filling the house with acrid smoke. Liam rushed down, his frustration finally boiling over. "Mom, what is going on?" I stood by the sink, humming an off-key tune from my childhood, my eyes distant. "I thought I heard the doorbell," I said. His face hardened. I saw him clench and unclench his fists. When Isabel later found me staring at a family photo, tracing Liam's baby picture with my finger while whispering my brother's name, she sent a text message from the hallway. She didn't think I could see her reflection in the darkened window. They were ready to close the trap. And so was I. The following Tuesday, Liam placed a thick manila folder on the kitchen table as I stirred my oatmeal. He didn't meet my eyes. "It's time we got some things in order," he said, his voice strained. He tapped the folder twice, then slid it toward me. I took it upstairs to my room, my hands trembling, a small, deliberate detail for his benefit. Once the door was closed, my hands were perfectly still. I pulled on my reading glasses and opened the folder. The documents were neatly clipped together, a durable power of attorney and a financial guardianship request. Bright yellow highlighting marked the signature lines. A sticky note in Liam's handwriting read, "Lawyer needs these signed by Friday for final filing." There was no hesitation left in me, no grief, only a cold, hard clarity. I took out my phone and photographed every single page. I then retrieved the sealed folder of my own notarized documents, the real ones, from my tote bag. This was the moment of exchange. I slid Liam's forged papers into an evidence bag Genevieve had given me and placed my authentic, legally binding documents into the manila folder he had provided. I left it on the corner of my desk, in plain sight. I met Genevieve in her office after hours. She examined the documents Liam wanted me to sign, her jaw tightening with each page. "If you had signed these, Ilara," she said, her voice grim, "you would have given him control of everything. Your medical decisions, your assets, the house itself. It would have made you legally invisible." The room felt suddenly airless. I handed her the bag with the fraudulent papers and the latest USB drive. She nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll contact the state's Elder Protective Services first thing in the morning." From her desk drawer, she pulled out a slim file labeled with my name. "Emergency contingency," she said. "I've had it ready for a week." That evening, I returned home with a quiet face. At dinner, Liam looked at me across the table. "Did you get a chance to look at the paperwork?" "I did," I said calmly. "I signed it. It's on my desk." A wave of relief washed over his face, so visible it was almost pathetic. Isabel's smile was triumphant. They thought they had won. They didn't know they had just walked into a trap of my own making, armed with documents that rendered them powerless. The next morning, I was in the garden when the courier arrived. He handed a crisp legal envelope to Isabel. I watched from behind the roses as she tore it open. It was the formal cease and desist warning from Genevieve's office, stating that any continued pursuit of guardianship would be met with legal action, as a formal complaint had already been filed with state oversight. Isabel's face went white. She stormed into the house. A few minutes later, Liam came out to the garden. He was holding the manila folder I had left on my desk. His hands were shaking. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't what our lawyer drafted. This names Alistair Finch as executor." I finally stopped pretending. I met his gaze, my own clear and steady for the first time in weeks. "That," I said, my voice devoid of weakness, "is the truth. It's been the truth for 6 months." The realization dawned on his face, a slow, sickening wave of understanding. The fog in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was the shattering of his own self-deception. "You knew," he breathed. "This whole time you've been acting." "A performance for a performance," I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as the autumn air. He looked from the papers in his hand to my face, as if seeing me for the first time, not his fading, forgetful mother, but a stranger he had fundamentally misjudged. "Why?" he asked, the word cracking. "You should be asking Isabel that," I said. "And then you should be asking yourself." He didn't have an answer. He just stood there, the papers fluttering in the breeze, a man who had gambled away his soul and lost. A week after Liam and Isabel left, the house settled into a quiet I had forgotten was possible. It wasn't the silence of tension, but the deep, peaceful hush of a space that has nothing left to hide. They left without a fight. Genevieve's letter, combined with the discovery of the real trust documents, had shown them the futility of their position. There was no apology from Liam, just an emptied closet and a set of keys left on the kitchen counter. I sat on the front porch, a thick blanket wrapped around my shoulders, as the late afternoon sun cast a golden light through the skeletal branches of the oak trees. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I let myself breathe. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't listening for whispers. I was simply present. A car pulled into the driveway, and 3 young people stepped out, their jackets bearing the crest of a local university. They were the first recipients of a grant from the new initiative I had funded, the Arthur Vance Foundation for Cognitive Integrity. My entire estate, the house, the savings, the investments that Liam and Isabel had coveted so desperately, had been quietly and legally transferred into a trust 6 months ago. Its purpose was to fund research and advocacy for victims of elder fraud and coercion. The young woman with bright, intelligent eyes handed me a folder outlining their first project. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "You're making it possible for stories like yours to be heard and to be prevented." She didn't know the whole story, of course. She didn't know about the recorders or the shoebox archive or the bone-deep chill of being betrayed by your own child, but she knew enough. My legacy would not be a house or a stock portfolio. It would be this, a shield for others forged in the fire of my own quiet war. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and rose, a profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't triumph and it wasn't revenge. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you can't erase a person who refuses to be forgotten. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't a shout, but a whisper of truth that cannot be silenced. And sometimes the greatest inheritance you can leave is not what you own, but the strength you inspire in others to reclaim what is rightfully theirs, their voice, their dignity, and their story.